Welcome to everyone in New York this week and joining us from around the world to this important event on Vietnam's climate prisoners. My name is Maureen Harris. I'm a senior advisor at International Rivers and a member of the Vietnam Climate Defenders Coalition. This is a group of international environmental, climate and human rights organizations concerned about the imprisonment and threats we are seeing to climate leaders and civil society in Vietnam in the context of a just energy transition. I'm very pleased to be part of this really important discussion today on behalf of the Coalition and 350.org. And I'd like to thank the event organisers and the Climate Week hosts for making this event possible. I'll start by briefly introducing today's speakers. Nama Chowdhury is the Chief of Public Engagement at 350.org. Who has for more than 20 years campaigned for meaningful causes across the global North and South and founded the Cause Impact Agency. Meena Jagannath is Director of Global Programs at Movement Law Lab. Prior to joining the lab, Meena co-directed the Community Justice Project, Miami-based movement lawyering organization supporting campaigns for racial justice and human rights. Ana Maria Gonzalez Ferrero is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Fundación por la Educación. Ana dedicated 30 years to working with vulnerable communities in Colombia and was honored as one of the 12 global leaders in the Obama Scholar Program by Columbia University in 2018 to 2019. And Phil Robertson has served as Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch's Asia Division for the past 13 years and has worked to defend human rights in Asia for many more. So thank you all very much for being here. And I'd now like to invite Nama to deliver some opening remarks from New York. Over to you, Nama.
Thank you, Maureen. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for making the time to join us from wherever in the world you are right now. Many of you in uncomfortable hours in your own time zones. I have the privilege of being in New York right now, where it is currently a very civilized 4 p.m., though it is also the middle of a very busy, very intense week, with several major events that have raised, at least for me, several major emotions. I have felt the adrenaline rush of being one of 75,000 people who brought their passionate chants to the streets of New York City. I've experienced the warm feeling of community, knowing that this march was one of several in major cities around the world as part of a global call to end fossil fuels. Around the world, people are uniting to power up a new world, one which benefits people, not polluters, one that is built on the principles of justice and equity. The global wave of action to end fossil fuel reliance and to usher in the renewable energy revolution has only underscored for us the critical role of people power in the fight against climate change. And that people power gives me such hope, such powerful inspiration. In this same week, though, I have had the opportunity to bear witness to the urgency and the righteous anger of activists who congregated in pouring rain on Monday to flood Wall Street and demand that financial institutions end their support of the fossil fuel industry. I saw scores of activists being arrested and read with relief that they were all released later that same day. That wasn't the case in other parts of the world, though. I've shared with the shock we felt when we read on the 15th that 4 fellow activists in Uganda were arrested, and they were held for 5 days before they were released on bail just yesterday. They still await their next hearing, where we will learn what sentence will be handed down. But even as we exhaled at hearing news of their being released, we received even more terrible news from Vietnam, with the arrest of Ngo Thi To Nguyen, the director of a think tank who has been working towards the country's energy transition. Her arrest and the continued detention of others in Vietnam is part of a very disturbing trend that we can see all around the world. We've gathered here today to express our solidarity, to share our concerns at this repression of climate defenders like Hoang Thi Minh Hong, whom we lovingly refer to as Hong, and Dinh Dan Bac, known as Bac, who have been imprisoned in Vietnam simply for trying to make our shared world a better place. 2023 has seen the hottest days, the hottest months, and the hottest summer on the books. As a heavily climate-impacted country, Vietnam is one of the top 5 countries likely to be most affected by climate change. And as an emerging economy, Vietnam has an instrumental role to play in ensuring a just, equitable response to climate change. But this cannot happen while Vietnam's climate leaders are kept locked up in jail. Earlier this year, Vietnam became a recipient of a multilateral financing model, a Just Energy Transition Partnership, which we're all referring to these days as the JETP. There are similar JETP deals being negotiated in other countries. These are partnerships which, if they're properly implemented, have the potential to help Global South countries leapfrog fossil fuel development and achieve the clean energy future that we all know is possible. At 350.org, we have teams working on JETP in many countries around the world, in Indonesia, South Africa, Senegal. And a central principle is the need for civil society to be able to meaningfully participate in the design and the monitoring of any such deals, including the ability to critique policies without fear of persecution. You can imagine how hard it is to uphold that principle when we see that Vietnam is imprisoning the very people whose expert advice is needed to make this transition possible. I'm also very aware of where I'm sitting right now, just a few blocks away from the United Nations HQ, in the heart of the city, and as part of the event that has brought so many climate advocates together. The US is one of the biggest funders of Vietnam's JETP, and this Climate Week comes hot on the heels of US President Biden's state visit to Vietnam, where he was looking to strengthen diplomatic ties. But while politicians discuss these issues that pertain to the future of billions of people, they do so behind closed doors, with members of civil society, the supposed benefactors of these financial partnership schemes. They are left at the fringes of the discussion at best, and locked up and hidden away in prison at worst. We have tremendous respect and deep concern for all of our activist colleagues whose personal freedoms have been curtailed in this way. Hong, in particular, is a dear friend and colleague of 350's. Her activism, her advocacy, her passion has reverberated far and wide. In her home country of Vietnam, her work, together with that of Bach and many others, has played an instrumental role in many of the country's most prominent environmental achievements, and has inspired people like us all across the world. If we are to effectively tackle the greatest challenge of our time, we desperately need climate defenders like Hong and Bach. There is a real need for leaders to buck this disturbing trend and to show that they can be climate leaders, for them to put the just into just transitions. Doing so will mean championing the right of civil society. It will mean allowing free and fair expression as being central to any climate financing deals. The first step towards this must be in freeing Vietnam's climate prisoners. I'm going to pass back to you now, Maureen, to tell us the full story behind each of these brave movement partners and how we might all be able to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nama, for your opening words, inspiring and outlining the incredible actions that are taking place in New York at Climate Week and globally, and extremely sobering in the issues that we're here to discuss today. This discussion is both timely and urgent. Global efforts to mobilize essential finance for the energy transition are proliferating, and the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP, is one such important vehicle, as Nama alluded to. At the same time, in many parts of the world, hard-won progress on climate change is threatened as climate leaders, journalists, grassroots advocates, Indigenous peoples, NGOs, and many others face increased crackdowns, threats, and targeting from governments and powerful vested interests. And what is at stake is firstly the opportunity for a transition that is indeed just and that centres the human rights of those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and the necessary disruptions of the energy transition. But beyond that, what is at stake is the very success of the energy transition and our collective efforts to meet and address the climate crisis. So as Nama outlined, over the past 2 years, Vietnam has imprisoned 6 people playing a key role in the country's energy transition. Since mid-2021, 4 climate leaders who were instrumental in pushing Vietnam to make strong commitments to phase out coal and achieve net zero, winning recognition and praise from among Vietnam's leadership and others around the world have been sentenced and imprisoned for their efforts on trumped-up tax evasion charges. These arrests occur against a backdrop of crackdowns on civil society organizations in Vietnam, restrictions on activities and threats of intimidation and closure, including organizations who are working on environmental and energy issues. Dung Dinh Bach was detained in June 2021 and is now serving 5 years in prison. He's an environmental public interest lawyer who worked to advise and represent communities affected by industrial pollution and environmental harm. He was arrested following his efforts to call for greater accountability in Vietnam's climate and energy investments. 3 others were also sentenced on tax evasion charges, including Nguyen Thi Khan, an energy policy expert and Goldman Environmental Prize winner, journalist Mai Phan Loy, and lawyer Ba Khong Dung. Kang and Loy, as they're known for short, have both been released early from prison this year following international advocacy, and Bach and Zung remain in prison. We have a short video to highlight Bach's story and the story of the others who faced imprisonment.
Chồng tôi là một người làm việc trong lĩnh vực pháp lý, là làm cái công việc của một người bảo vệ môi trường. Tôi không bao giờ tưởng tượng được là anh Bách sẽ bị đi tù vì cái công việc mà anh ấy làm. Thật sự là đến thời điểm hiện tại, gia đình tôi đã sống trong sự hoang mang, lo lắng đến cực độ về sức khỏe, về tính mạng của chồng tôi. Và không bao giờ nghĩ rằng cái cảnh đấy nó lại đến với gia đình tôi. Em chỉ mong muốn quốc tế hãy kêu gọi để trả tự do cho anh Bách, vì nó không đáng để phải bị như thế.
Since this video was produced, the situation has worsened. On the 31st of May this year, just weeks after Kang's release, Hoang Thi Minh Hong was detained on charges of tax evasion. Hong is a climate activist and founder and leader of the environmental group Change Vietnam, raising public awareness on climate and sustainability issues for the country. And we also have a short video to highlight Hong's story, which we'll show now. And just last Friday, as Nama mentioned, police detained Nguyen Thi Thu No, Executive Director of the Vietnam Initiative for the Energy Transition, who's known as Nguyen. VIETC, her organization, is an independent energy think tank in Vietnam. No public information has been provided on the reason for her arrest or possible charges. Nguyen is not an activist, but a researcher and technical expert on energy policy and environmental economics, and who has previously worked on projects with entities such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Union, UN Development Programme, and Vietnam's Ministry of Industry and Trade. At the time of her detention, she was working closely with the Vietnamese government and other lead partners, providing technical and policy advice for the development of the Vietnam JETP's resource mobilization plan. So alongside this highly concerning pattern of arrests and imprisonment, Vietnam negotiated the $15.5 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership with G7 and other countries, which was formally announced in December last year. Efforts are now underway to develop the JETP resource mobilization plan, scheduled for completion and approval by November, and which will enable the financing to start flowing. To achieve a just energy transition, civil society and public participation are critical. Climate leaders and organizations are at the forefront of efforts in Vietnam, as they are globally, to address the climate crisis and embrace a more sustainable and just world. And civil society is essential for a financing program such as the JETP in ensuring transparency and accountability in how plans are developed and implemented and commitments are met. And they provide independent monitoring of the impact of the energy transition and support vulnerable communities to advocate for their rights. The JETP financing partners have explicitly affirmed the role of civil society in the high-level political declaration for the JETP, in official statements following the arrest of climate leaders, in policy and safeguard commitments to respect human rights, guarantee public participation, and protect environmental and human rights defenders from retaliation. Yet, discussions on the development of the Vietnam JETP continue to forge ahead with little public attention to these issues. So what does this mean in the context of Vietnam's energy transition and for just transition financing globally? I'd like to turn to our panel to discuss these issues. And our first two speakers will be sharing some personal insights on Bac and Hong to highlight who they are and their critical importance for a just energy transition. Our third speaker will discuss Vietnam's climate prisoners in the context of the broader human rights situation in Vietnam and its implications for the JETP and its political context, including Vietnam's important and recently elevated relationship with the United States. Mina, I'll hand over to you to share more on Bac's situation and your work with him.
Sure. Thank you, Maureen. And thank you to 350.org, the organizers of this panel, and my fellow panelists for their efforts to raise concerns about the human rights situation in Vietnam. And of course, special thanks for this opportunity to speak more specifically about Bac. As my colleagues mentioned, with the unfortunate news of the most recent arrest of Nguyen, we only see the situation in Vietnam with respect to environmental defenders getting worse. The failure of President Biden to insist on assurances with respect to the release and continued safety of environmental defenders seems to have emboldened the government to continue to crack down on these leaders who have been calling for transparency and accountability as Vietnam negotiates the contours of its energy transition. I hesitate to say the just part of the just energy transition because an energy transition cannot be just as long as environmental defenders like Bac languish in prison for the important work that they've done on behalf of communities and the environment in Vietnam. As Maureen mentioned earlier, Bac is a well-known, well-respected lawyer and environmental justice leader in Vietnam. He dedicated his life to ensuring that people were aware of their rights, that they knew the content of the law and the nature of the projects that were being proposed in their communities. His work has been well recognized well beyond Vietnam. For example, he's worked with American University's law school. He's traveled to the US before and elsewhere, and he even received a grant from the US Department of State. I personally know Bac since 2019 through his involvement in a network that I coordinate, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers. And he is a member of several other global and regional networks where he has always participated very actively. Even as Bach has been imprisoned since June 2021, he has continued to speak out about the ills of continued coal mining and other polluting projects along the Mekong River. From the very beginning, Bach has refused to accept the pretextual tax evasion charges under which he is being held for a prison sentence of 5 years. And these 5 years are well beyond the prescribed 2-year sentence for tax evasion. And it's a longer sentence than the sentences of the other defenders who are being held under the same charges. Bach has been vocal about the continued violation of his rights, both in terms of the process by which he was arrested and found guilty, and with respect to the conditions under which he's being held. In spring of this year, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions issued a thorough and well-researched opinion finding Bach's detention to indeed be arbitrary. And in March, Bach had declared that he would be going on a full hunger strike around the 2-year anniversary of his arrest in June. In response, a number of advocates around the world, some of whom are on this call, from the US to Haiti to South Africa, Palestine, Colombia, India, carried out a solidarity hunger strike to draw attention to Bach and other Vietnamese defenders' ongoing unjust detention. Undeterred, the Vietnamese government arrested Hong, as Maureen mentioned, at the end of May in the midst of that solidarity strike. And now, as you've heard, they've arrested yet another defender. Though a couple of the Vietnam Five, as they were known, and now 6, have been released, we fear that Bach is being disproportionately punished for his outspoken protest of the conditions and the circumstances under which he's being held. I want to use this moment to call particular attention to something that we were very concerned about. At this moment, we are concerned for Bach's well-being and physical safety. As of August, Bach has stopped receiving food from the prison officials in protest of the conditions of his detention. And now the amount of food that his family is able to bring in is also being restricted. It appears that the prison is treating Bach and other political detainees more harshly. This is supported by various reports that we've gotten from the inside. One being that the personal belongings of Bach and other political prisoners have been confiscated, including their reading lights, their clocks, and Bach's health supplements, which he uses to treat asthma. In addition, Bach's letter to the president of Vietnam was not approved for delivery, and his personal writing to his wife was not approved for delivery. And in addition to that, she's not been able to give him personal letters or photos. Moreover, Bach has been severely mistreated and beaten for his outspokenness. For example, on August 31st, we learned that Bach and at least one other prisoner were physically threatened by men wearing prison uniforms who were wielding knives. Bach also reports that people entered his cell around midnight, which suggests that prison officials unlocked his cell to facilitate the attack. It has been reported that on September 5th, Bach was assaulted by prison officials, sustaining injuries to his head, neck, hands, and elsewhere, for which he has refused medical treatment by the prison. I must note with some irony that Vietnam has spent a lot of money on amplifying its commitment to preventing torture and implementing the recommendations of the Committee Against Torture that were issued in its last review in 2018. The government has done this to great effect in state-run media, even though, for example, the details of Bach's case contradict what progress they seem to be touting. Given the gravity and the urgency of the allegations of torture and mistreatment of Bach, we think it's particularly important for us to redouble efforts to call for Bach's release. To that end, members of our coalition will be submitting a complaint to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, documenting the numerous violations against Bach that violate the Nelson Mandela rules on the minimum standards and treatment of people deprived of liberty. These include, as I mentioned, being held incommunicado, confiscation of personal medications and other devices, and obviously the physical attacks against him, which can constitute ill treatment and may rise to the level of torture. This is in addition to the ongoing surveillance and lack of privacy for any communications that he has had with his family and attorney. We also must highlight that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has already found that his treatment did not comply with the Mandela rules and may constitute torture. And finally, of course, in light of the recent visit by Biden to upgrade the US's diplomatic relationship with Vietnam, we must reiterate that strengthening diplomatic ties with Vietnam without raising these concerns enables Vietnam to continue its pattern of persecution and violence against environmental defenders. Our colleagues have also called on other special rapporteurs to denounce this treatment as torture and to remind the government of Vietnam about its duties of care towards the people that it has detained. We're also requesting that you all in the audience, supporters and civil society generally demand Boc's immediate release and call out the practice of the Vietnamese government in using pretextual criminal charges to silence and punish civil society leaders who are working to ensure that Vietnam's energy transition process is indeed just, inclusive, and accountable to the communities impacted across the country. If you personally have diplomatic contacts, we're asking that you write to those contacts with a message to release Hong, Boc, and the others, because, as we said, a just transition cannot take place while leaders like them are still in jail. We also must require that JETP financing and implementation be contingent on explicit protections against retaliation and reprisals for environmental and human rights defenders, together with policy frameworks for free and safe participation of civil society in JETP design, decision-making, monitoring, and implementation. I know I've talked for a while, so there's more information available at a website, standwithboc.org. We'll put that in the chat as well. And that on the website, you'll find messages that you can share on social media. And of course, you should use the hashtag standwithboc and hashtag freehong anytime you tweet or use Instagram or any social media on to call for their release. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Maureen.
Thank you so much, Mina, for discussing more on Boc's situation, the importance of the work he was doing, and some of the actions that have been taken to engage different entities around his situation and to call for his release. And there is more information, which we'll also be sharing at the end on websites and other materials where you can find out more, and also how to engage. I'd now like to invite Anna to share your reflections on Hong.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention, I want this to make to be a very personal intervention, because I think that when we speak about activists, we tend to forget the person, the human being. So I'm here to tell everybody a little bit about who Hong is to me and probably to the cohort of Obama scholars that met her in New York in 2018. The first memory I have of Hong is a very funny one, because she was late to our very first meeting because she was buying pots. And at that point, we didn't know why she was buying pots. But later on, we were to find that she was a great pho maker. So she literally fed every one of us in the cohort with delicious pho, taught some of us how to make it, including my kids. Fortunately, I could travel with my kids, who were 15 years old and 12 years old at the moment. And they enjoyed Hong's company very, very much. It took her, when I got to New York, we got a set of kitchenware that was the standard set of kitchenware that was given to every student. It took Hong 1 week to have a fully blown up home with every kitchen utensil and like pots, pans, pictures hanging on the wall, decorations and clothes, like if she had lived there for ages. She's funny, witty. Another thing I strongly remember about her is the way she introduced herself in one of the very important like networking events that the Obama Scholars Program set up for us in Chicago. That struck me very much, because it also tells, and that's something I really wanted to say in this space that was given to me to speak about her. I want to mention how strong she is and how upfront she is, and she's also funny. How can you handle being all this? She introduced herself in a all-American meeting, like everybody in there was from Chicago. And she said, "Hi, my name is Hong and I am from Hong Kong." I am from Vietnam, but Hong is like Hong in Hong Kong. "And when I was born, you were bombing my country." I remember the faces that everybody made. They were like struck, but that's okay. We're over with that. And she continued her speech. Vietnam, I learned a lot about Vietnam because Vietnam was, for me, has always been a place very far away. And so I had never really thought about the possibility of even having a friend. But because Hong and I were the older people, like in the cohort, we became very, very good friends. And her apartment was definitely one of the common places to be for everybody. We had wine there, we laughed, we played games, and she was a lot of fun. When I heard the news about Hong being imprisoned, the first thing I have to say in this space is that I knew this was going to happen. It was evident. She felt that the situation was getting more and more difficult. Some of her friends had been called in. We knew about the taxation rules and how they were being used to oppress different types of activisms. She had been forced to close her nonprofit organization. And I myself, as a nonprofit director, knew how hard it was to keep it alive. So I could only think about how difficult it was for her to have to make that final decision, just to take off some of the pressure. I had the opportunity to meet Hong a couple of times after we left New York in 2019. And she was her old self every time. She was funny, witty, having a lot of strong positions, and she was always smiling and also being very open and very clear about her positions and about not changing them. I always wondered why she didn't flee. That has always, I've rethought about that so many times. Why she didn't leave Vietnam. She had all the opportunities. She could have just left. But because of her principles, because of her family, because of her kids, she decided to stay. And so it has struck me, and it has struck me in many different ways as a woman, as an activist, to see what has been happening and what has been going on. Yesterday, when we were in the prep call for this event, I was surprised that I almost couldn't even speak to the people from the tech team and to Liang Yi, who generously invited me to speak today. It was the first time I ever spoke out loud about the pain of not having Hong with us. I can only think of how she's organizing in there in jail and trying to keep everybody happy and feeling loved, because she's a very, very caring person and a very empathic and funny person. So I can only see her in the midst of people, caring for them and understanding them and listening to everybody and just joking around. But at the same time, in that conversation, I noticed about my own feelings, about my own emotions, that it was the first time I actually spoke about Hong. I had written, I chatted my life away with some of the scholars. We have interacted in many, many different ways about this imprisonment, and we've tried to do drives in many different ways, written articles, written letters, participated in various ways. But all of this was through my internet, through my phone. And when I spoke about Hong, I couldn't hold my tears back. And I realized how imprisonment not only means something very strong for the person who is imprisoned, but also it gives a very strong message to the people around her. And I realized something more, and it is the huge disconnection that deliberately exists between vulnerable countries, South-South relations, and in particular relations, for example, between Latin America and Southeast Asia are almost non-existent. So while my other friends from the cohort could do so many things for Hong, because they were in New York, in Paris, in all these centers of the world, I, in the periphery, could only tweet and write letters. And I really didn't have a way to activate solidarity for somebody so far away and from such a big disconnect. This speaks to the need of creating more and more South connections. And it also made me very grateful to have the Obama Foundation find us, put us together in the same apartment building, give us the same cohort. If it weren't for the Obama Foundation scholarship, I would have never met her. I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't have noticed that it's necessary to speak up from wherever we are to defend the rights of the people that go through different ways of psychological pressure to stop bringing forth change. To have Hong's back today means the world to me. To be working for her liberation, to be working for giving more visibility to this issue means the world to me. Because the other opportunity and what happened in the past was sheer silence. I understood, I read about the issues, but the disconnect was huge. And so I think, and to speak about this seminar itself, I think it's incredible to realize how we can connect together, we can speak from wherever we are, and we can really become a network to protect each other, to demand from governments that these things shouldn't be happening to normal, loving people like Hong, with a cat, with a boy, with a husband, and with a huge group of friends that adore her. She taught me how to drink bubble tea. I had never had bubble tea in my life. I will always associate bubble tea with her. And I have to say that I'm here waiting for her to drink my next cup of bubble tea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was incredibly moving and really brought Hong to life for all of us, I think, as well as your time together studying at Columbia in the Obama Scholars Program. And thanks for the reminder, such an important reminder about the humanity first of the individuals we're talking about and of these climate prisoners, that first and foremost, they're individuals and they're loved by many people. And that's fundamental for us to think about and to remember in sort of the actions that we take around this. Thanks also for your call to action around building the network and the movement in calling for the release of these important individuals, and they're highlighting their essential, how important they are to the energy transition and how dedicated they are to their work and to what's needed for their country, for Vietnam. So I'd like to, actually, before I move to Phil as the final speaker, I'm just going to mention, so we've focused in this webinar on highlighting the stories of Bark and Hong in particular. And I mentioned earlier that a couple of the others who were imprisoned have since been released. And so we're focusing on these individuals because they have asked us and the international community to advocate for them, to call for their release, to highlight the issues that they're facing. And so we're honoring their wishes as well as the wishes of others who are taking, their own decisions around their situation. So I just wanted to make that clear to those listening today. Finally, I'd like to hand over to Phil to share your insights on the broader context in Vietnam and the implications both for the energy transition as well as some of the broader politics around the energy transition and Vietnam's relationships, including with the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you also to 350 and all the other groups involved in helping organize this very important and timely event and inviting me on behalf of Human Rights Watch to speak. It's really actually a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to raise awareness and rally action for these brave environmental activists behind bars in Vietnam. Now, the previous speakers have already told you a lot about the climate change activists who've been in prison in Hanoi on what we consider to be wholly bogus, politically motivated charges. And Human Rights Watch's view is that they did nothing wrong, and there is absolutely no reason for Vietnam to hold them. And accordingly, we are calling for the Vietnamese government to quash the convictions or drop the charges against them for those who haven't been charged yet, and immediately and unconditionally release all 4 environmental leaders. And more of that, permit them to resume their activities without harassment and interference going forward. So this is really a call for the International Partners Group and also for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero Working Group that they need to recognize that there really just can't be any just energy transition partnership with Vietnam so long as Hanoi keeps imprisoning climate change and environmental leaders in the country. That's the bottom line. And from my perspective, that should be our demand as well as discussions move forward about the international resources required for the JETP program in Vietnam. Now, we just learned yesterday that Hanoi decided to commemorate New York City Climate Week by hauling away yet another environmental defender, Ngo Thi Ton Nguyen, who's the executive director of the Vietnam Initiative for Energy Transition. She's worked with the World Bank, she's worked with the EU, the UN, the ADB on climate change research and programs. And she joins the others who are now behind bars. And, I'm not sure who the international community thinks they're actually going to be working with in Vietnam on the JETP when so many of these civil society experts are sitting in prison. And in fact, we inspected that given the priority that the Biden administration has put on combating global climate change, that President Biden and his climate envoy, John Kerry, would have insisted that all these climate change activists be released as a prior condition for Biden's visit to Hanoi on September 10th. But even that was not achieved, which leads us to conclude that in human rights terms, Biden's visit to Hanoi was a massive failure. Human rights got left behind in the upgrade of the US-Vietnam relationship to what the Vietnamese classify as a comprehensive strategic partnership. All that was promised on human rights was a continuation of the annual US-Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue, which is basically a false hope that guarantees no progress whatsoever. To give you a perspective, this human rights dialogue is one which rotates every year between Hanoi and Washington. And for 2 days or so, mid-level officials from the US and Vietnam discuss and argue about human rights, and then basically agree to disagree and issue a joint statement to that effect. The net result is to conveniently provide an excuse for both sides to say that they talked about human rights, which means that they can check the box and wait to talk about it again next year. To be fair, both the EU and Australia also have similar human rights dialogues with Vietnam with a similar lack of results. So it reminds me of the old saying, misery loves company, fits well here. Let me say a bit about Vietnam's overall human rights situation, which I hope we can put into context the situation we're facing as we strive to get our friends released. Put simply, Vietnam's human rights record is a total disaster. Since 2017, when the Trump administration reversed the Obama administration policy and pulled the US out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which included Vietnam, and then stopped raising any human rights issues with Hanoi whatsoever, we've seen more arrests and much longer prison sentences for critics and activists of all types in Vietnam. It is not an exaggeration to say that Vietnam's once vibrant human rights and democracy dissident movement has almost been completely wiped out, with people either behind bars or fled into exile. Right now, as of today, Human Rights Watch counts 166 political prisoners behind bars in Vietnam who have been in prison for things like peaceful expression, mostly for online or in-person criticism of the government, for organizing or joining peaceful public protests, for joining independent organizations not allowed by the government, for asserting their right to freedom of religion and belief, for advocating for land rights or environmental rights, or for simply being a leader or a member of a suspect ethnic minority like the Khmer Krom in southern Vietnam, or the 6 main hill tribe groups collectively known as Montagnards who reside in the Central Highlands. Beyond those 166 political prisoners in prison, there are another 17 individuals that we know of that are also in pretrial detention, which can be as long as a year, and they're awaiting trial. In front of Vietnam's politically controlled kangaroo courts, there's no doubt that all 17 of them will be convicted. And actually, I would say that our political prisoner figures are conservative because Human Rights Watch applies strict criteria, but other groups that we work with list more than 200 political prisoners behind bars in Vietnam. Either way, this figure is the second highest number of political prisoners held by any government in Southeast Asia, and the figure is continuing to grow. Most of them are in prison using very vaguely worded or loosely interpreted provisions of Vietnam's penal code, such as carrying out activities aimed at overthrowing the People's Administration, or making, storing, disseminating, or propagandizing information, conducting propaganda against the state, or my favorite, quote, abusing the rights to democracy and freedoms to infringe upon the interests of the state, legitimate interests in organizations and individuals. If anyone can tell me what that means, I would appreciate it. So far, despite the fact that Vietnam has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, core civil and political rights like freedom of expression, association, peaceful public assembly are entirely absent in what is an intrusive, aggressive, and well-organized single-party state that severely punishes any sign of dissidence. And we're also seeing efforts to move activism online. The activism online has been hit with heavy surveillance, patrolled by government-backed cyber police and volunteers, and enforced by repressive laws that criminalize any criticism of the government or the Communist Party, as well as, quote, anything that offends the nation, the national flag, the national emblem, the national anthem, great people, leaders, notable people, and national heroes. And even the Army gets into the action. It has a Force 47, which is its online information warfare unit, with thousands of soldiers logging on to both post pro-government views on social media, as well as attack and report what the government considers to be wrong views online. So it's no surprise then that social media companies like Facebook are bombarded with content takedown requests from Vietnam. All this is part of a targeting of any sort of reformist activities or liberalizing trends that the party and the government designates using the pejorative moniker of peaceful evolution. And unfortunately, it appears that the climate change and environmental movement in Vietnam has now been included in that so-called peaceful evolution category by the ruling party and the government. If all of this sounds like a lot like another Asian country, China, well, you're right, because many of the same tactics and strategies that we've seen in China and their crackdown on human rights are also being used in Vietnam, reflecting the continued close relationship between the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Communist Party of China, and between the Vietnam Ministry of Public Security with its Chinese counterpart. All this despite Joe Biden's best efforts to make friends with Hanoi. And I would say what's really surprising, though, is how the international community, such as the EU, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and others, are letting Vietnam get away with all of this. In fact, Vietnam is on a roll. You know, they've been designated as one of the first batch of JETP countries. They got invited to the G7 meeting in Hiroshima. So far, they're the EU's first and only, so far, free trade agreement partner in Southeast Asia, with the EU looking the other way on blatant violations of various human rights and labor rights conditionalities in the treaty. Of course, we've got Biden, who went to Hanoi earlier this month. And shockingly, Vietnam was elected to the UN Human Rights Council in a term that will expire in 2025. So our bottom line is, in addition to freeing our friends, which is critically important, it's time for the international community to stop giving Vietnam a free ride and demand that they be held accountable for their rights abusing actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phil, for giving that sort of comprehensive and sobering overview of the situation in Vietnam, and including the recent political developments, and how this issue with the Vietnam climate prisoners fits into that broader context of Vietnam's worsening human rights situation. So we've had a couple of questions coming in through the chat. One, I think, has sort of been alluded to by Phil already in his remarks, but someone asked the question that if money for the JETP is coming from the US, should we be asking for this money not to be sent to them? So I want to invite the panelists if you'd like to sort of say anything more on this question.
I would say yes. I would say that this is a critical point of leverage, that for Vietnam, it is about the money. What we saw during the negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership was that leverage on wanting to be part of a trade treaty was sufficient to also get concessions on human rights. And that at a minimum, all the climate change activists should be released before any sort of money is released for JETP. And there has to be, I think, some framework for also civil society involvement in JETP that would provide some protections going forward so that we don't just see, a number of people released and a new batch arrested.
And if I may, I'd like to add another perspective to that, Maureen. I think Phil is right. And the agency that we each have depends on our location. And so definitely for those of us that are in the wealthier states that are donating or, are the ones that are making the financial deals for these partnerships, certainly it's important to use that leverage, as Phil is suggesting. At the same time, I think it's important for us to recognize the agency that exists in people that are in the recipient countries. And to recognize that for them, this is an opportunity for civil society actors in recipient countries. It's an opportunity for the JETPs to change the tonality of the discussion between civil societies and governments. If we can remind them, if we can say that, putting the justice back, as we are saying, the just back into the just transition. In my view, and the view shared by several colleagues across the movement, is that these JETPs actually allow an opportunity for us to invite in greater participation, and for governments to turn to civil society with this genuine invitation to do, as we were saying, use the expertise of people like Hong, of Park, to shape what their country's energy future is going to look like. And so it's really important for us to recognize both sides of leverage, as it were, and use our agency wherever we are. And I'll say it's taken a long while for us in the climate movement to direct finance away from fossil fuels. So finance that is being directed now towards the renewable energy movement is certainly important to channel in the right way. And so the justice element needs to be upheld even as we're supporting the transition to renewable energies. Thanks, Maureen. Back to you.
Thanks so much for adding that. And I really agree with you that the agency in recipient countries is so important to recognize, and this issue of climate defenders and participation is such a critical part of climate justice. Do any of the other panelists want to add anything on this question? Referring to the US or referring to any of the other partners in the JETP and actions that they should take? Anything to add?
Well, the only other thing that I was going to add, there, as folks on this call know, there's an effort to also call on funders like the UNDP to take into consideration the human rights context in Vietnam. And then sort of parallel to this JETP is just the investments that corporations like Apple and others are making in Vietnam, and actually trying to think about what kind of leverage we as civil society might have on those investments to make sure that, the countries that they choose to invest in are ones that are actually moving towards policies and practices that support a just energy transition and support the sort of just and human rights element of that. So, that goes a little bit beyond the JETP, but just to say, just to the question of how, what can folks do to help, I do think that, putting pressure in all of the places where pressure can be put is an important thing to do.
Thank you, Meena. And just to add to that in terms of the position of the coalition, so as mentioned, the international partner governments, the financing institutions, the many other actors supporting and driving the Vietnam JETP have obligations through their international human rights and other commitments and their policy statements to safeguard climate defenders, civil society, and public participation. So what we're doing as the coalition is calling on them to apply these commitments to the JETP and to the just energy transition before funding is mobilized, and to ensure these existing commitments can be met. And that means ensuring the release of Bark, Hong, and others unjustly imprisoned. And it also means ensuring that the JETP includes explicit protections against further retaliations and effective measures to ensure that civil society groups don't continue to be targeted and can participate freely and safely in the JETP and the monitoring of its implementation. If there's no further comments on that, moving to the other question that came in, which is what can we do to help? Mina, you started to answer this question. Do you or others have further things to add on this?
I would say, having worked on Vietnam human rights issues for a number of years, there's two things. I mean, Vietnam government is very transactional when it deals with the international community. So the costs have to be raised to Vietnam to continue for their continued imprisonment of these climate activists. There has to be concerted international pressure, which involves public outcry. It involves governments saying things publicly and privately. It involves, government saying to Vietnam, well, we were prepared to try to do something with you on this, but we're going to have to hold off until you let those people go. There has to be something that, really raises the bar on Vietnam, because Vietnam right now feels like it can get away with everything. That's what the Vietnamese government thinks right now. They think they're on a roll. They've got President Biden visiting. They were at the G7. JETP wants to give them $15.5 billion, and they can still imprison climate activists with no problems. I mean, they think that the world is their oyster right now, and they have to be disabused of that by concerted pressure, which means that we have to get, for instance, the European Union and its parliaments to speak up. We have to get the US Congress to say more. We have to get the Australian government to recognize they have to speak up on human rights and not just do trade deals. Unfortunately, Vietnam thinks that because it's in the confluence of the growing tension between the US and China, that it can do whatever it wants and no one's going to call it out. And as long as that continues, they will continue to imprison climate activists, human rights defenders, and others, because they believe that those people constitute a threat to their power, even though, to be honest, they don't. I mean, our friends don't want to change the Vietnam government. They just want to change the Vietnamese government policy on climate change and on coal. And that's what they were doing. But the Vietnam government can't see the difference between activism on a particular policy issue and subversion. And that's the shortcoming and the deficiency of the Vietnam government. And the only way to deal with that is to really put pressure on them and make them realize that they will hurt more if they continue to do these kind of things rather than letting people go.
I was so moved by hearing Anna talk about Hong that I think it's important for us to build on that emotion and that energy as well, right? When Phil is talking about the strategic role of civil society in exerting that leverage, exerting that pressure, it's also important to remember that civil society includes all of us. It's all of us people. And so let's bring back the human being to show up in community for the Vietnam climate defenders, and to really bring the human me to community with the human them. And starting to show, we've heard how Bark actually decided to call off his hunger strike when he saw the outpouring of support from the international community, and he felt personally that his voice was being heard, even from behind prison. We've heard how Hong has seen videos and messages shared via her family and has drawn comfort and courage from those. So I think just you're taking action, to everyone who's on who's listening to this right now, you're taking action and bringing that human yourself to the conversation only strengthens them further. And it shows in the more strategic sense as well, it shows the governments that, we are showing up as civil society. So it's really important for us to continue to keep that action. And a couple of URLs have been shared with you before, but it's super important for us to do every little bit, every tweet, every X, as it's now called, every post that we make with that with those hashtags does get noticed, does make a difference.
Thank you, Nama. Very powerful words and sort of a call to action to all of us, I think. Mina and Anna, are there any final words that you'd like to say briefly before we close?
Yes, sometimes I feel that Latin America is a little bit left out from the global conversation. I think Africa has done a great job at appearing in the global conversation. Yet Latin America is simply way off. We are still proudly funding fossil fuels, getting a lot of money. And I do have a president that has started to speak up about climate issues. Before joining the government, I was working on climate finance. And I was thinking how it's so unfair that the southern countries get indebted into their adaptation efforts. And one thing I was doing while I was in New York, I was counting the number of leaders that in Colombia were being assassinated for speaking up, just for speaking up. And so I was thinking that we should have a global movement counting, because it seems that we spur, like, because of the moment, we kind of get in, something goes into attention for a while, but this has been systematic and it has been going on for a long time. And to build the movement and to keep the humanity, we have to feel that all of them are us. Like, one thing that is really clear for me is that even though for me Southeast Asia was basically inexistent before, because of so many breaches that we have, even through globalization and whatever, it's still culturally so strange. I remember going to the market with Hong to buy the things she ate and just laughing because we couldn't believe that we were so different, right? And yet still being able to just start to feel and as I heard Nama, I could also sense this idea that humanity is a people, one. And so we need to start counting and having bigger numbers and adding up, because it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Guatemala, it's happening in Salvador. Colombia has an issue, a big issue with this. We have this issue in Bolivia, we have it in Chile. It doesn't get enough attention because we're not building together. And so I think my call to action is, like, we need to really work on this. We really need to work on visibilizing how governments strike leaders that are going against the policies that don't work for them.
Thank you, Anna. Mina, any final words?
I'll be very
want to
brief.
add?
I echo everything that my colleagues have said. The one thing that I'll just say to just bring the spirit of Bach into this space is just, I mean, he always insisted, even as we were, doing the hunger strike, that we do so with love and peace in our hearts. So I think let's continue the fight, and let's continue to do so with intentionality and a vision for love, peace, and a healthy planet.
Thank you, Mina, and thank you, Bach, for that reminder. The climate crisis arises out of injustice, and the response through the energy transition and its financing frameworks has to be an opportunity to do things differently. And that means insisting on commitments to justice, to human rights, inclusion of marginalized voices, principles of public participation as a fundamental part of the process and not as a side issue. And it absolutely means including those who have worked so tirelessly to highlight and meet the challenges we face and help develop solutions. So I want to give a big thank you to all our speakers and to the hosts and organizers for making this event and this discussion possible, and to all the participants for joining and sharing questions and being part of this event. As we've been saying, and I hope you're inspired to do so, you can continue to be engaged on these issues. There's opportunities to take action and to find out more information through the two websites that were listed, 350.org's free Hong site and the Stand with Bark website. You can also contact us for more information and resources and questions on how to support this movement. And you can request a copy of the recording of this event for also wider sharing. So thanks so much once again. This concludes our session today, and wishing you a beautiful evening or morning wherever you are in the world. Thanks so much.